The wind whistled through the half-empty spaces of my apartment as I kneeled on the hardwood floor, sorting through the remnants of my former life. Cardboard boxes surrounded me like sentinels, each one containing pieces of the carefully constructed facade that had once been Olivia Westcroft, marketing director at Pinnacle Media. But that woman no longer existed. In her place was just me, unemployed, abandoned, and boxing up designer blazers I could no longer afford to dry clean. The vibration of my phone against the floor startled me. I glanced at the screen, expecting another pitying text from a former colleague or perhaps an automated rejection from one of the dozens of jobs I'd applied to. Instead, I saw a name that sent an icy chill down my spine. Mother. 3 months of silence, and now this. My finger hovered over the decline button before curiosity won out. Hello? My voice sounded strange even to my own ears, too formal, too guarded. Olivia. My mother's clipped tone carried all the warmth of a January blizzard. I heard about your situation. Your father and I were wondering when you planned to tell us. I pressed my back against the wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. I didn't think you'd be interested, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. Considering how our last conversation ended. The memory of that disastrous Sunday dinner flooded back. My announcement about leaving the law firm to pursue marketing met with stony silence, followed by my father's cutting words. No daughter of mine throws away a Yale law degree to play with advertisements. My mother's sigh crackled through the phone. Well, perhaps if you had listened to us about that ridiculous career change, you wouldn't be in this predicament. I closed my eyes, counting silently to 5 before responding. Is there something you needed, Mother? Your father and I think it might be best if you moved back home until you sort yourself out. We have standards to maintain in this family, Olivia. We can't have people talking. There it was, the real concern. Not my welfare, but the Westcroft reputation. I'm not moving back to Connecticut, I said, my voice finally finding its strength. I appreciate the offer, but I'll be fine on my own. Don't be stubborn. You can't possibly afford that apartment anymore. And what will you do for money? I looked around at the space that had become my sanctuary, the first place that had ever been truly mine. I'll figure it out. I always do. Olivia, please be reasonable. I have to go. I'll call you later. I ended the call before she could protest. I placed my phone face down on the floor, drawing my knees to my chest as tears threatened to spill. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd hurt me. Not again. My gaze fell on the single unopened box in the corner, the one containing my most desperate contingency plan. Inside lay the manuscript I'd been working on secretly for years, documenting the rise and fall of tech giant Helix Industries through the eyes of its disgraced founder's executive assistant. The story no one had ever told because everyone who knew the truth had signed ironclad NDAs. Everyone except me. The universe had a way of opening doors when others slammed shut. Perhaps this was my moment to finally walk through. Taking a deep breath, I crawled over to the box and pulled it open. The thick stack of papers stared back at me, both an accusation and a promise. What do I have to lose? I whispered to the empty room. The answer was simple, nothing. They had already taken everything else. 12 months later, I sat in the luxurious office of Elaine Shepard, my literary agent, staring at the contract before me with a mixture of disbelief and elation. 7 figures, Olivia. For a first-time author, this is unprecedented. Elaine's usually composed voice held a note of awe. The film rights alone are worth more than most writers see in a lifetime. I ran my fingers over the embossed letterhead of Horizon Publishing, trying to process the string of zeros on the advance line. They really think it's worth this much? Elaine leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. Worth it? Darling, you've written the business exposé of the decade. Every major publisher was in a bidding war. Horizon just happened to have the deepest pockets. She pushed the contract toward me. Sign before they come to their senses. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the pen. One signature and my life would change completely. No more ramen noodles for dinner. No more choosing between electricity and internet. No more lying awake at night wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Have you told your family? Elaine asked as I signed the last page. I set down the pen, a bitter smile twisting my lips. No. They made it clear that writing wasn't a real career when I mentioned it years ago. Well, perhaps this will change their minds, Elaine said, sliding the contract into a folder. 7 figures tends to have that effect on people. I thought of my father's dismissive snort when I'd once mentioned wanting to write, of my mother's cold suggestion that I focus on practical pursuits, of my brother James's mocking laughter. Perhaps, I replied, though I doubted it. But as I left Elaine's office that afternoon, the New York City sun warm on my face, I didn't care about changing their minds. For the first time since losing my job, I felt something close to peace. I had bet on myself when no one else would, and I had won. I wasn't naive enough to think the money would solve all my problems, but it gave me something I'd been lacking for too long: options. Freedom. The luxury of time to figure out what I truly wanted. And if the Westcrofts never approved? Well, I was finally beginning to understand that their approval had always come with strings I was better off without. The buzzing of my phone interrupted my thoughts. I glanced down, expecting Elaine with some forgotten detail about the contract. Instead, I saw a text from my brother James, the first contact from any family member in nearly 10 months. Just heard about your book deal. Impressive, sis. Let's catch up soon. I stared at the message, a cold sense of foreboding settling in my stomach. News traveled fast in publishing circles, but not that fast. I had only signed the contract 20 minutes ago. Which meant someone had been watching. Waiting. I slipped my phone back into my pocket without responding. Whatever game my family was playing, I wasn't ready to join. Not yet. Maybe not ever. For now, I had a book to finish and a new life to begin. And this time, I would be the one setting the rules. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of edits, interviews, and promotional planning. My book, The Helix Deception, was slated for release in 3 weeks, and pre-orders had already pushed it to the top of Amazon's bestseller list. The New York Times had requested an exclusive interview, and Vanity Fair wanted a feature. My phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, book clubs, and conference organizers. But the calls I dreaded most came from Connecticut, increasingly frequent as news of my success spread through my parents' social circles. I stared at my phone as it lit up with my mother's name for the 3rd time that day. Against my better judgment, I answered. Mother, I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back? Olivia, darling, I've been trying to reach you for days. Her voice held an unfamiliar warmth that immediately put me on edge. Your father and I would love for you to come to dinner this Sunday. To celebrate your success. I nearly dropped the phone. In 32 years, the Westcrofts had never celebrated anything I'd done unless it aligned perfectly with their predefined notion of achievement. I'm sorry, I can't this weekend. I have deadlines. Surely you can spare one evening for family, she pressed, a familiar note of irritation creeping into her tone. James will be there with Vanessa and the children. They're all so excited to see you. The same James who had ignored my existence for nearly a year. The same Vanessa who had once told me that marketing seemed like such a simple field for someone of your intelligence. I really can't, Mother. My schedule is packed until after the book release. A heavy sigh. Your father will be disappointed. He's been telling everyone at the club about his daughter, the famous author. I bit back a bitter laugh. The last time I'd seen my father, he'd called my writing a hobby for bored housewives. I'll try to visit soon, I lied, knowing I had no intention of doing so. Give my love to everyone. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the sofa of my new apartment, a spacious two-bedroom in Tribeca with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen I barely used. The advance from Horizon had allowed me to trade my cramped walk-up for this sleek space, though most days I felt like I was living in a hotel rather than a home. My phone began to ring again almost immediately. This time it was James. I let it go to voicemail, but a text followed seconds later. Mom says you're too busy for family. Some things never change, do they? I stared at the message, anger churning in my stomach. Of course she would twist my words. And of course James would believe the worst of me without asking for my side. Some things truly never did change. I was about to put my phone on silent when it rang once more. Unknown caller. Probably another journalist. Hello? Olivia Westcroft? A man's voice, unfamiliar. Yes, who's this? Paul Reeves, Connecticut State Police. I'm calling about your parents. My blood ran cold. What about them? There's been an incident at their home. Your father has been injured, and your mother is quite distraught. They've asked for you to come as soon as possible. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter. What kind of incident? Is my father okay? He's stable, ma'am. I can't share more details over the phone, but your presence would be helpful to the investigation. Investigation. The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. I'll be there as soon as I can, I promised, already calculating the fastest route to Connecticut. As I hung up, dread pooled in my stomach. Whatever had happened, it must be serious for my mother to have asked for me specifically. Despite everything, they were still my parents. And whatever game they might be playing, I couldn't ignore a police call. I just hoped I wouldn't regret walking back through the door I'd fought so hard to escape. The drive to my parents' estate took just under 2 hours, each mile increasing the knot of anxiety in my stomach. As I pulled through the wrought iron gates and up the winding driveway, I was struck by how little had changed. The manicured lawns, the precise rows of hydrangeas flanking the stone path to the front door, the imposing facade of Connecticut limestone, it was all exactly as I remembered, a pristine monument to Westcroft perfection. Except for the police cruiser parked at the entrance. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, gathering my courage. The last time I'd been here, I'd left in tears after my father had called my career choice a pathetic attempt at rebellion. Now I was returning as a soon-to-be published author with a 7-figure advance and film deal. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I approached the front door, it swung open to reveal my mother. Her usually impeccable appearance was noticeably disheveled, hair falling from its neat twist, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. Olivia, thank God, she breathed, pulling me into a stiff embrace. The unfamiliar gesture caught me off guard. Where have you been? I've been calling and calling. What happened? I asked, extracting myself from her arms. The police said father was injured? She glanced nervously over her shoulder before lowering her voice. Someone broke in last night. They held us at gunpoint while they emptied the safe. Your father tried to stop them and was struck in the head. Fear gripped me. Despite our differences, the thought of my father being hurt made my chest tighten. Is he all right? He's upstairs resting. The doctor gave him something for the pain. She tugged me toward the living room. The detective wants to speak with you. With me? Why? I wasn't even here. She avoided my eyes. There are complications. In the living room, a tall man in plain clothes stood examining the family photographs on the mantel. He turned as we entered, his expression carefully neutral. Ms. Westcroft? I'm Detective Paul Reeves. He extended his hand, which I shook automatically. Thank you for coming so quickly. Of course, I replied, glancing between him and my mother. Though I'm not sure how I can help. I wasn't here when it happened. The detective nodded. I understand. However, there are some aspects of the break-in that are unusual. Unusual how? He consulted his notebook. According to your parents, the intruders seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. They went straight for the safe in your father's study, bypassing valuable artwork and electronics. They also mentioned you by name. I felt the blood drain from my face. Me? Why would they mention me? That's what we're trying to determine. Detective Reeves studied me carefully. Your mother mentioned that you recently signed a significant publishing deal. Is that correct? I shot my mother a look of disbelief before responding. Yes, but I don't see how that's relevant. The intruders specifically asked about Olivia's book money. They seemed to believe your parents had access to your finances. My jaw clenched as the implications settled over me. The break-in, my father's injury, the sudden interest in my success after months of silence, it all started to form a disturbing picture. They don't, I said flatly. No one has access to my finances except me. Detective Reeves nodded, making a note. I see. Ms. Westcroft, would you mind listing anyone who might have known about your recent success and also been aware of your parents' home address? That would be a long list, I replied, thinking of the press releases, the interviews, the social media announcements. My book deal wasn't exactly a secret. True, but the connection to your parents might not be as widely known. He paused. Unless someone was deliberately looking into your background. A chill ran through me at his words. I hadn't considered that my success might make my family targets. Despite our strained relationship, the thought of them being hurt because of me was unsettling. I'll need to speak with my father, I said. When will he be awake? My mother's hand fluttered nervously to her throat. The doctor said we should let him rest, but I'm sure he'd want to see you. Detective Reeves closed his notebook. I've got what I need for now. I'll be in touch if we have any developments. He handed me his card. Call if you think of anything that might help the investigation. After he left, an uncomfortable silence settled between my mother and me. She seemed to shrink before my eyes, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Why didn't you tell me what happened when you called earlier? I asked, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. She sank onto the sofa, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her slacks. I didn't want to worry you over the phone. And I thought you might not come if you knew. The admission hung in the air between us, painfully honest. She wasn't wrong. Of course I would have come, I said, though we both knew it was more complicated than that. My mother looked up at me, her eyes surprisingly vulnerable. Olivia, there's something else you should know. Your father and we've been having financial difficulties. I stared at her in disbelief. The Westcrofts, with their multi-million-dollar estate, their vacation homes, their generations of old money, having financial difficulties? It seemed impossible. What kind of difficulties? She looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. Your father made some investments that didn't pan out. The market crash hit us harder than we let on. We've been keeping up appearances, but... She gestured vaguely around the immaculate living room. It's all smoke and mirrors now. The revelation stunned me into silence. My entire childhood had been defined by Westcroft wealth and the prestige it afforded. To hear that it might have been a facade, at least recently, shifted something fundamental in my understanding of my family. And it raised a disquieting question: was their sudden interest in my book deal about more than just reconciliation? How bad is it? I asked finally. Bad enough that we've had to mortgage the house. Bad enough that your father's been unable to sleep for months. She met my gaze directly. Bad enough that we were going to ask for your help, even before this happened. The words hit me like a physical blow. After all their dismissal of my choices, my career, my independence, now they wanted my money? I see, I said, my voice carefully controlled. And the break-in? Was that real, or was it just a dramatic way to get me here? My mother's face crumpled with genuine hurt. Of course it was real. How can you even ask that? Before I could respond, a weak voice called from upstairs. Is that Olivia? My mother stood quickly. He's awake. Come, he'll want to see you. As I followed her up the familiar staircase, I tried to sort through the tangle of emotions choking me. Concern for my injured father. Anger at the years of rejection and criticism. Suspicion about the timing of their financial revelation. And beneath it all, a tiny, persistent flicker of hope that perhaps this crisis might bridge the chasm between us. But as I approached my father's bedroom door, one thought cut through the chaos with crystal clarity: whatever happened next, I wouldn't let myself be manipulated by guilt, by obligation, or by the desperate need for approval that had shaped too many of my previous decisions. I was no longer the daughter who would do anything to earn a Westcroft nod of approval. I was Olivia Westcroft, soon-to-be best-selling author. And this time, I would write my own ending. My father lay propped against ivory pillows, a bandage wrapped around his head. The sight of him, diminished, vulnerable, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through me. Robert Westcroft had always been a force of nature, his presence filling every room with an intimidating energy. To see him like this, reduced by circumstances beyond his control, seemed wrong somehow. Olivia. His voice was weaker than I remembered, but the sharp intelligence in his eyes remained unchanged. You came. Of course I came, I replied, awkwardly hovering at the foot of the bed. How are you feeling? He gestured to the chair beside him. Like I've been hit with a golf club, which isn't far from the truth. Damned thieves used my own 9-iron on me. I sat, unsure how to navigate this strange new dynamic between us. Detective Reeves told me what happened. He said they mentioned me. My father's gaze sharpened. Yes. They seemed quite interested in your recent windfall. He studied me for a moment. 7 figures, I hear. For your first book. The pride in his voice caught me off guard. Had news of my success finally earned his respect, or was this just another manipulation? Elaine is an excellent agent, I replied, deflecting. Mother says you've been having financial troubles. His expression darkened. Your mother shouldn't have told you that. Why not? I think I have a right to know if someone's targeting my family because of my money. My father sighed, wincing slightly at the movement. It was meant to be temporary. A cash flow issue that got out of hand. I had investments lined up that would have solved everything. And now? Now we're facing foreclosure on the house, potential bankruptcy, and the complete dismantling of the Westcroft legacy. He said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than the collapse of everything he'd built his identity around. Unless I can secure a significant capital injection within the next 30 days. The clinical way he laid it out, like a business problem rather than a family crisis, reminded me of everything that had driven me away in the first place. And that's where I come in, I suppose? I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. The daughter you dismissed is suddenly worthy of your attention now that she has money you need. My father had the grace to look ashamed, his gaze dropping to his hands. I deserve that. I've not been the father you needed, Olivia. I pushed too hard, expected too much, and then punished you for choosing your own path. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine directly. I was wrong. The admission stunned me into silence. In all my years, I had never heard Robert Westcroft admit to being wrong about anything. Your success proves it, he continued. You knew yourself better than I ever did. And I'm proud of you. Truly proud, not because of the money, but because you had the courage to follow your convictions. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe that his approval wasn't contingent on my newfound wealth. But the timing was too convenient, the change of heart too sudden. Let's say I believe you, I said carefully. How much are we talking about? To save the house, to solve the immediate crisis? My father named a figure that nearly made me gasp. It was substantial, not enough to bankrupt me with my new advance, but enough to make a significant dent. That's a lot to ask. I know. He reached for my hand, an unprecedented gesture that threw me further off balance. And I have no right to ask it. After how we've treated you, I wouldn't blame you for walking away. His honesty disarmed me somewhat. This wasn't the imperious father I remembered, the man who had cut me off emotionally when I dared to defy his plan for my life. This was someone more human, more fragile. But still capable of manipulation. I need to think about it, I said, standing. And I need to talk to the detective again. If someone's targeting you because of me, throwing money at the problem might not solve it. My father nodded, seeming to accept my caution. Of course. Take your time. We've waited too long to reach out to you, we can wait a bit longer for your decision. As I left his bedroom, my mother was waiting in the hallway, her expression anxious. Will you help us? She asked without preamble. I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the fine lines of strain around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. I haven't decided yet, I answered honestly. There's a lot to consider. Her face fell, disappointment radiating from her. I see. Do you? I asked, suddenly tired of the pretense. Because what I'm considering isn't just whether I can afford to help you. It's whether I should trust the sudden change of heart from people who made it clear I wasn't good enough for them. My mother flinched as if I'd slapped her. That's not fair, Olivia. Isn't it? You didn't call when I lost my job. You didn't offer help when I was struggling to pay rent. Dad told me I'd thrown my life away, and you stood by silently while he did it. We were wrong, she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. We were wrong about so many things. I wanted to believe her, just as I'd wanted to believe my father. But the scars from their rejection ran too deep for immediate trust. "I'll be in touch," I said, moving past her toward the stairs. "I need some time." As I drove away from the estate, my mind churned with conflicting emotions. Despite everything, they were my family. Could I really turn my back on them in their time of need? But another voice whispered insistently, could I really trust that their newfound appreciation for me wasn't just a means to an end? I needed more information. About the break-in, about their financial situation, about everything. Before I made any decisions, I would do what I did best: research, analyze, and find the truth hidden beneath the surface. This wasn't just about money. This was about finally understanding where I truly stood with the Westcrofts, and whether any relationship worth salvaging remained. I spent the next 3 days diving into a different kind of research than I was used to. Instead of corporate espionage and tech industry corruption, I was investigating my own family's financial collapse. What I discovered was both shocking and, in retrospect, predictable. My father, the consummate risk-taker in business, had leveraged the family's assets to make a series of increasingly desperate investments, chasing the high returns he'd enjoyed in his younger years. As losses mounted, he'd borrowed against the house, liquidated trusts, and apparently drained whatever college funds remained for James's children. The break-in, according to Detective Reeves, was still under investigation, but they were exploring a connection to one of my father's former business associates, a man named Victor Hargrove, who had lost millions in a venture my father had enthusiastically backed before pulling out at the last minute. "We're looking into Mr. Hargrove's whereabouts on the night in question," Reeves told me during our follow-up call. "But so far, he has an alibi that checks out." "And the mention of my book deal? My money?" Reeves sighed. "That's where things get murky. The only people who should have known about that connection would be family members or very close associates." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Are you saying it might have been an inside job?" "I'm not saying anything definitive at this point. Just that we're exploring all angles." After hanging up, I stared at my laptop screen, where I'd been compiling notes on the various financial entanglements my father had created. One name kept appearing in the more recent transactions: James Westcroft. My brother had apparently been deeply involved in the family's financial decisions over the past year, serving as a co-signer on loans, facilitating the restructuring of assets, and, if the paperwork I'd obtained was accurate, acting as the primary contact with the bank threatening foreclosure. Yet in all our conversations since my return, no one had mentioned James's involvement beyond noting that he would be devastated by the loss of the family home. My phone buzzed with a text from the very person occupying my thoughts. "Heard you're playing hardball with Mom and Dad. Stay classy, sis." I stared at the message, fury building inside me. After a decade of James being the golden child, the son who followed the approved path, who became a lawyer like our father wanted, who married the appropriate woman from the appropriate family, he had the audacity to judge me for hesitating to bail them out. I tapped out a reply. "Interesting how involved you've been in Dad's financial dealings, and yet you haven't offered any of your own money to help. Stay hypocritical, bro." His response came immediately. "Some of us have families to support. Must be nice to only have yourself to worry about." I nearly threw my phone across the room. The implication that my lack of children somehow made my life less valuable, less worthy of consideration, was a familiar Westcroft refrain. James had 3 children he used as shields whenever difficult situations arose, as if procreation automatically granted him moral superiority. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to respond rationally rather than emotionally. "If you'd like to discuss this like adults, I'm available." Otherwise, I suggest you focus on your own contributions to the solution rather than criticizing mine. I set my phone down and returned to my research, but the exchange with James had crystallized something for me. It wasn't just my parents who had treated me as an afterthought, a disappointment, a resource to be tapped when convenient. It was the entire family system. James and I had once been close, building forts in the woods behind the estate, sharing secrets late into the night during summers at the lake house. But as we grew older, the weight of Westcroft expectations had driven a wedge between us. He had embraced the prescribed path, while I had questioned it. And in the Westcroft household, questioning was tantamount to betrayal. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. Unknown caller. Hello? Ms. Westcroft? This is Amanda Chin from Horizon Publishing. I just wanted to check in about the launch party details for next week. Are you still planning to bring guests from your family? I'd forgotten about the launch party entirely, a lavish affair Horizon was throwing at one of New York's most exclusive venues to celebrate the Helix deception and generate press buzz ahead of its release. In a moment of optimism months ago, I'd requested tickets for my parents and James, hoping that seeing my success firsthand might bridge the gap between us. Yes, I heard myself say. For guests, as discussed. Excellent. We'll have them on the list. Is there anything else you need from us at this time? After hanging up, I sat back in my chair, a plan forming in my mind. The launch party would be the perfect opportunity to observe my family's behavior in a public setting, to see whether their newfound appreciation for my work was genuine or merely a performance to secure my financial help. I picked up my phone and called my mother. Olivia? Have you made a decision? The hope in her voice was palpable. Not yet, I replied. But I wanted to invite you, Dad, James, and Vanessa to my book launch party next week in the city. It's going to be a significant industry event, and I'd like you to be there. There was a pause before she responded, her voice suddenly bright with excitement. Oh, Olivia, we'd be honored. Your father will be well enough to travel by then, I'm sure of it. The eagerness in her acceptance made me question my own motives. Was I setting them up to fail, looking for evidence to justify refusing their request for help? Or was I genuinely giving them an opportunity to show support for my career, even if it came years too late? Perhaps it was both. Great, I said. I'll text you the details. Black tie, of course. My mother laughed, a sound I'd heard so rarely in recent years that it startled me. Of course. We are Westcrofts, after all. The familiar refrain, delivered without a trace of irony, reminded me of everything I'd been trying to escape. The invisible standards, the relentless pressure to uphold the family image, the crushing weight of generations of expectations. The Westcrofts were coming to my launch party. And one way or another, by the end of that evening, I would have my answer about whether reconciliation was possible, or whether my success had merely made me a convenient solution to their problems. Either way, I would finally know where I stood. And this time, whatever happened, I would be the one in control. The night of the launch party arrived with a flurry of last-minute details. My publicist had arranged for a car service to pick me up at 7:30, and as I stood in front of my mirror making final adjustments to my outfit, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Gone was the uncertain, approval-seeking daughter who had left Connecticut in disgrace. In her place stood someone confident, polished, successful on her own terms. My midnight blue gown hugged curves I'd once been self-conscious about, and my hair, cut into a sleek bob instead of the long waves my mother had always insisted were more flattering, framed a face that had finally stopped waiting for permission to shine. The doorbell rang promptly at 7:30. I grabbed my clutch, took one last look at myself, and whispered, "Remember who you are now." The venue, a rooftop garden atop one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels, took my breath away. Elaine had mentioned that Horizon was sparing no expense, but the reality exceeded my expectations. Fairy lights twinkled overhead, champagne flowed freely, and New York's literary elite mingled with film producers and publishing executives, all gathered to celebrate my book. My book. There she is. Elaine materialized at my elbow, resplendent in emerald green. The woman of the hour. Come, there are at least a dozen people you need to meet. For the next hour, I moved through the crowd in a daze, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, fielding questions about the book's explosive revelations and my plans for a follow-up. The energy was intoxicating, and I found myself relaxing into the moment, savoring this peak after so many valleys. Then I saw them. The Westcrofts had arrived en masse, my father leaning slightly on my mother's arm, his head bandage replaced by a more discreet dressing, James and Vanessa trailing behind them like perfect satellites to their sun. They stood just inside the entrance, scanning the crowd, and I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Before I could decide whether to approach them, my editor, Marcus, appeared at my side. "Olivia, you've outdone yourself. The early reviews are even better than we hoped." He followed my gaze to my family. "Ah, are those your parents? Let me introduce myself." Without waiting for a response, he steered me toward them, his hand warm at the small of my back. "Mr. and Mrs. Westcroft," he called as we approached. "I'm Marcus Delaney, Olivia's editor. We're so honored you could join us tonight." My father straightened, his handshake firm despite his recent injury. "The honor is ours. We've always been immensely proud of Olivia's talents." The blatant lie nearly made me laugh out loud. Instead, I plastered on a smile. "Marcus has been instrumental in shaping the final manuscript. I couldn't have done it without him." "Nonsense," Marcus countered with a warm smile. "Your daughter's manuscript was extraordinary from the first draft. We simply polished what was already brilliant." My mother beamed, seamlessly shifting into the role of proud parent. "We always knew Olivia was destined for greatness. She's been writing stories since she was a child." Each false claim felt like a knife twisting in my side. I caught James's eye over our mother's shoulder, noticing his thinly veiled discomfort. At least someone remembered the truth. "If you'll excuse us," Marcus said, "I need to borrow our star author for a moment. Publishing business." As he led me away, I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Family dynamics," Marcus murmured knowingly. "Always complicated." "You have no idea," I replied. The evening progressed like a perfectly choreographed dance. Speeches were given, glasses clinked, contracts for my second book ceremoniously signed in front of cameras. Through it all, I watched my family work the room with practiced Westcroft charm, claiming pieces of my success as if they'd nurtured it all along. By midnight, when the final guests departed, one thing had become crystal clear: the Westcrofts hadn't changed. They'd simply found a new way to use me. And this time, I knew exactly how to respond.